This is Pong, one of the first commercially successful video games. Without Pong, video games might not be as much of a prominent media as it is today. Now, looking at this, you probably have one question in your mind. How did we go from that to this? Allow me to teach you about the history of the technology that allowed video game graphics to evolve. The pre-NES era. The Atari 2600 could only display up to two 8-bit sprites, two missiles, and one ball object on each scan line. And all of these were typically monochrome, meaning that it was like one color. You can kind of picture how hard it is to really make good visuals for a game with such limited capacity for graphics. But I'm going to give you a couple of examples to show that, yeah, it really was kind of not amazing. With such limitations, it meant that if something wasn't integral to gameplay, it wasn't going to be shown. And even if it was shown, it would be shown in the most bare-bones way possible.
The 8-bit era.
The 8-bit era's console... Ah! The 8-bit era's generation of consoles' big upgrade to graphics came from the advancement in sprite-based technology. Gone were the days of being limited to only two 8-bit sprites on screen at once. Now, you could have up to 64 8-bit sprites on screen at once without issue. Gamers, rejoice! But that's not all, because these sprites were now able to have more than one color. Woo! The golden standard for these 8-bit consoles was the ability for sprites to have 3 whole colors and 1 transparent color for a total of 4 whole colors. That's 3 more colors than the Atari 2600. This allowed characters and environments in video games to actually feel more like characters and environments, rather than square go through colored hallways in Greyland.
The 16-bit era.
The 16-bit era, similar to the 8-bit era, had its big upgrade to graphics due to the advancement of sprite-based technology. The difference here, however, is that while the 8-bit sprites were stuck to looking extremely simplified and chunky with little to no shading, 16-bit sprites were able to look much more smooth and didn't need to make sacrifices to add things like shading to a character. This was due partially to the fact that sprites during this era were able to have more color than previously possible on 8-bit hardware, with sprites now being able to have 15 colors and 1 transparent color per sprite, making a total of 16 colors. Another factor that added on to this fact was the fact that 16-bit processors used in these consoles were able to do everything that their older 8-bit brothers could do, but better. This included the ability to process much bigger sprites with much less problems. Mario, you were doing such a good job helping me show concepts like this off. Now look what you did. Go home. With the SNES also came the introduction of a thing called Mode 7. Something that allowed games to scale and rotate the background layers to give an illusion of 3D depth. Before this, the only place you could find something like this was in the arcades. Now you could have this kind of technology at home. And most people weren't bringing arcade machines home. Most people. The early 3D era. The early 3D era's big graphical update was 3D. It was just fully fledged 3D. Consoles were able to just do that now. Before this point, consoles were unable to render things like polygons and textures. The reason why was because it didn't have the chips needed to do that. And the reason why it didn't have those chips was because they didn't need the chips, because there was no games using the chips. However, due to the need to innovate, graphics technologies improving, and the fact that customers were getting annoyed that they couldn't look at all angles of the sexy red Italian, it meant that the medium of gaming had to go into the realm of full 3D. 3D characters, 3D landscapes, 3D fish. All of this allowed players to be able to explore every nook and cranny of a game world, move the camera in entirely new orientations to see entirely different things. While this did mean that development for games got a bit harder, with developers having to take into account that players were no longer locked to one fixed camera angle, it meant that as a player, you could simply just rotate the camera in game and see things in ways that you wouldn't have been able to see before with sprite-based technology. I mean, imagine if you could do that with a painting. I don't like this angle. And then you like move the camera 90 degrees only to find out that there's an evil goblin creature in the painting of the Mona Lisa. Now, early 3D was very blocky and pointy. This was due to the fact that consoles at the time weren't able to handle the polygons required to do really smooth 3D models. Details like a character's face, cliff faces, and even trees were done using textures. Basically, think of it as like paper mache. You have a balloon underneath, then you plaster a bunch of newspaper on it. That's basically textures.
The smoothing era.
The smoothing era was all about smoothing out the rough edges that came from the early ages of 3D. This came with the adoption of dedicated GPUs and a widespread adoption of shaders and lighting. Now, you're probably asking, what's a GPU? Well, a GPU, also known as a graphics processor unit, is the thing that allows a computer or console to accelerate the process of rendering stuff like images, videos, polygons, and animations by handling many calculations at once. Now, the sprite-based consoles didn't need GPUs. Why? Well, that's because games weren't graphically complex enough at the time to need that. But with 3D becoming a mainstay, they couldn't just rely on the CPU for this stuff anymore. So this meant that consoles needed to adopt GPUs into their roster of hardware. Nintendo adopted a Dolphin. Now, GPUs didn't just allow for consoles that included them to render more polygons. No. GPUs allowed consoles to utilize things like bump mapping and shaders. So what the heckity heck is a bump map? Well, a bump map is typically a grayscale image that tells the shader's lighting calculations where to fake shadows and highlights to simulate surface depth without changing the actual geometry of a 3D model. The color black represented the deepest bumps, while white represents highest bumps, with everything in the middle representing, you can guess. Now you could have a flat cliff face, but there's little bumps in them that makes it look like it's not just one polygon, but a bunch of polygons because of how lighting worked. Hey, so I actually forgot to add the lighting part for the smoothing era in the script. So to help me explain lighting, I have my good friend Calvin who makes a cone game.
Okay, so up until this point, the lighting was kind of stupid. You know, they baked the lighting in. You know, the lighting was unchanging. It was static. But now we have cool lighting. We have specular highlights on surfaces of objects.
Amen.
On God. We have real-time shadows.
For real?
For real. We have advanced algorithms like that of the Source Engine that if we got a light source and an object, we can calculate which surfaces are going to be affected by the shadow in the way... Zam. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Now you know. Yeah. The HD era. Aside from just the normal advancements in the hardware that was used to render polygons and other stuff, this era's big advancement in visuals came from the adoption of HD. All consoles at this time, aside from the Wii, adopted the HDMI cord, which allowed consoles to output to TVs that had high definition LCD displays. Before this point, consoles used AV cables, those three cords that came in red, yellow, and white, which had lower resolutions and worse colors. But now that consoles used HDMI ports, they were able to display games in up to 180p resolution. The TVs that people played their games on were also going through a massive change during this time. So, how were you able to see these higher resolutions? Well, with the newer TVs. Gone were the big, bulky CRT TVs. Now we had the lighter, thinner, and scanlineless LCD screens. Now, this actually caused a lot of problems for older games, as the older consoles utilized the fuzziness and scan lines of CRTs to blend colors together in games. With these gone, a lot of older games got a massive visual downgrade when it came to how they looked. But aside from the older games, newer games actually benefited from this change, probably because they were designed for LCD displays and not CRT TVs. The newer games were able to have this kind of visual clarity to them. Like, you could see much, much more, much, much better. And that's because of these newer TVs being much more clear, and they didn't blend colors together like the older ones did. Yeah, the realism era. Yeah. This era had the biggest jump in lighting quality out of all the other eras. Can I be completely honest with you? We're at the point in the video where the upgrades in graphics became extremely boring. There's not really any exciting new technology. For the most part, it's just CPUs and GPUs got better and better, which allowed consoles to render more polygons and do more lighting than previous consoles. We got HDR and 4K resolutions, which made picture quality more clearer, but, we already got clearer pictures in the previous generation. It doesn't feel that special. Don't get me wrong, the games in this era are beautiful. Absolutely stunning pieces of art that would not have been possible before. Worlds and characters had such levels of realism to them that you could send a screenshot of one of these games to a news station and they'd mistake it for actual nature photography. That is a real thing that happened. This and the next era were ones that I personally dreaded writing about, as it just felt like there was nothing to talk about. Woo, it's the plateau era. Woo, yeah, woo. We have ray tracing support on everything now. Realistic lighting for everything and everyone. Woo, video games are starting to look more real than the real world. Outside of consoles, graphics card manufacturer Nvidia wants to introduce AI-generated lighting as something you can enable for games. Remember the first thing I asked in this video? How did video games go from the minimal level of graphics of Pong to such high graphic quality as Elden Ring? Now you know. It's technology. As technology evolves, so too does our ability to make more and more better graphics for games. I mean, we're no longer limited to basically anything when it comes to the visuals for video games. You yourself could make a video game and make it look however you want. Unlike the days of the NES, you can have sprites so detailed that you could zoom in and see simulated cloth. Unlike the days of the PS1, you can have 3D models so detailed that you can see a character's pores on their nose. We're no longer bound by the limitations that the video games of old had to abide by. And, that's actually pretty cool.
Oh shit.